Chapter 29 of the Two Destinies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 29. Our Destinies Part Us. Descending to the ground floor of the house, I sent to request a moment's interview with the landlady. I had yet to learn in which of the London prisons Van Brandt was confined, and she was the only person to whom I could venture to address the question. Having answered my inquiries, the woman put her own sordid construction on my motive for visiting the prisoner. "Has the money you left upstairs gone into his greedy pockets already?" she asked. "If I was as rich as you are, I should let it go. In your place, I wouldn't touch him with a pair of tongs." The woman's coarse warning actually proved useful to me. It started a new idea in my mind. Before she spoke, I had been too dull or too preoccupied to see that it was quite needless to degrade myself by personally communicating with Van Brandt in his prison. It only now occurred to me that my legal advisers were, as a matter of course, the proper persons to represent me in this matter, with this additional advantage, that they could keep my share in the transaction a secret, even from Van Brandt himself. I drove at once to the office of the lawyers. The senior partner, the tried friend and adviser of our family, received me. My instructions, naturally enough, astonished him. He was immediately to satisfy the prisoner's creditors on my behalf, without mentioning my name to anyone, and he was gravely to accept as security for repayment Mr. Van Brandt's note of hand. I thought I was well acquainted with the various methods by which a gentleman can throw away his money, the senior partner remarked. "I congratulate you, Mr. Germaine, on having discovered an entirely new way of effectually emptying your purse. Founding a newspaper, taking a theatre, keeping race-horses, gambling at Monaco, are highly efficient as modes of losing money, and they all yield, sir, to paying the debts of Mr. Van Brandt." I left him and went home. The servant who opened the door had a message for me from my mother. She wished to see me as soon as I was at leisure to speak to her. I presented myself at once in my mother's sitting-room. "Well, George," she said, without a word to prepare me for what was coming, "how have you left Mrs. Van Brandt?" I was completely thrown off my guard. "Who has told you that I have seen Mrs. Van Brandt?" I asked. "My dear, your face has told me. Don't I know by this time how you look and how you speak when Mrs. Van Brandt is in your mind? Sit down by me. I have something to say to you which I wanted to say this morning, but I hardly know why. My heart failed me. I am bolder now, and I can say it. My son, you still love Mrs. Van Brandt. You have my permission to marry her." Those were the words. Hardly an hour had elapsed since Mrs. Van Brandt's own lips had told me that our union was impossible. Not even half an hour had passed since I had given the directions which would restore to liberty the man who was the one obstacle to my marriage, and this was the time that my mother had innocently chosen for consenting to receive as her daughter-in-law Mrs. Van Brandt. "I see that I surprise you," she resumed. "Let me explain my motive as plainly as I can. I should not be speaking the truth, George, if I told you that I have ceased to feel the same serious objections that there are to your marrying this lady. The only difference in my way of thinking is, that I am now willing to set my objections aside, out of regard for your happiness. I am an old woman, my dear. In the course of nature, I cannot hope to be with you much longer. When I am gone, who will be left to care for you and love you in the place of your mother? No one will be left, unless you marry Mrs. Van Brandt. Your happiness is my first consideration, and the woman you love, sadly as she has been led astray, Is a woman worthy of a better fate? Marry her." I could not trust myself to speak. I could only kneel at my mother's feet and hide my face on her knees, as if I had been a boy again. "Think of it, George," she said, "and come back to me when you are composed enough to speak as quietly of the future as I do." She lifted my head and kissed me. As I rose to leave her, I saw something in the dear old eyes that mine met so tenderly, which struck a sudden fear through me, keen and cutting, like a stroke from a knife. The moment I had closed the door, I went downstairs to the porter in the hall. "Has my mother left the house," I asked, "while I have been away?" "No, sir." "Have any visitors called?" "One visitor has called, sir." "Do you know who it was?" The porter mentioned the name of a celebrated physician, a man at the head of his profession in those days. I instantly took my hat and went to his house. He had just returned from his round of visits. My card was taken to him, and was followed at once by my admission to his consulting room. "You have seen my mother," I said. "Is she taken seriously ill? And have you not concealed it from her? For God's sake, tell me the truth. I can bear it." The great man took me kindly by the hand. "Your mother stands in no need of any warning. She is herself aware of the critical state of her health," he said. "She sent for me to confirm her own conviction. I could not conceal from her, I must not conceal from you, that the vital energies are sinking. She may live for some months longer in a milder air than the air of London. This is all I have to say. At her age her days are numbered." He gave me time to steady myself under the blow, and then he placed his vast experience, his matured and consummate knowledge, at my disposal. From his dictation I committed to writing the necessary instructions for watching over the frail tenure of my mother's life. "Let me give you one word of warning," he said, as we parted. "Your mother is especially desirous that you should know nothing of the precarious condition of her health. Her one anxiety is to see you happy. If she discovers your visit to me, I will not answer for the consequences. Make the best excuse you can think of for at once taking her away from London, and whatever you may feel in secret, keep up an appearance of good spirits in her presence." That evening I made my excuse. It was easily found. I had only to tell my poor mother of Mrs. Van Brandt's refusal to marry me, and there was an intelligible motive assigned for my proposing to leave London. The same night I wrote to inform Mrs. Van Brandt of the sad event which was the cause of my sudden departure, and to warn her that there no longer existed the slightest necessity for ensuring her life. "My lawyers," I wrote, "have undertaken to arrange Mr. Van Brandt's affairs immediately. In a few hours he will be at liberty to accept the situation that has been offered to him." The last lines of the letter assured her of my unalterable love, and entreated her to write to me before she left England. This done, all was done. I was conscious, strange to say, of no acutely painful suffering at this saddest time of my life. There is a limit, morally as well as physically, to our capacity for endurance. I can only describe my sensations under the calamities that had now fallen on me in one way. I felt like a man whose mind had been stunned. The next day my mother and I set forth on the first stage of our journey to the south coast of Devonshire. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of the Two Destinies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Two Destinies by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 30. The Prospect Darkens. 3 days after my mother and I had established ourselves at Tarki, I received Mrs. Van Brandt's answer to my letter. After the opening sentences, informing me that Van Brandt had been set at liberty under circumstances painfully suggestive to the writer of some unacknowledged sacrifice on my part, the letter proceeded in these terms: "The new employment which Mr. Van Brandt is to undertake secures to us the comforts, if not the luxuries, of life. For the first time since my troubles began, I have the prospect before me of a peaceful existence among a foreign people from whom all that is false in my position may be concealed, not for my sake, but for the sake of my child. To more than this, to the happiness which some women enjoy, I must not, I dare not aspire. We leave England for the Continent early to-morrow morning. Shall I tell you in what part of Europe my new residence is to be? No, you might write to me again, and I might write back. The one poor return I can make to the good angel of my life is to help him forget me. What right have I to cling to my usurped place in your regard? The time will come when you will give your heart to a woman who is worthier of it than I am. Let me drop out of your life, except as an occasional remembrance, when you sometimes think of the days that have gone forever. I shall not be without some consolation on my side when I look back at the past. I have been a better woman since I met you. Live as long as I may, I shall always remember that. Yes, the influence that you have had over me has been from the first to last an influence for good. Allowing that I have done wrong in my position to love you, and worse even than that, to own it, still the love has been innocent, and the effort to control it has been an honest effort at least. But apart from this, my heart tells me that I am the better for the sympathy which has united us. I may confess to you what I have never yet acknowledged, now that we are so widely parted, and so little likely to meet again. Whenever I have given myself up unrestrainedly to my own better impulses, they have always seemed to lead me to you. Whenever my mind has been most truly at peace, and I have been able to pray with a pure and a penitent heart, I have felt if there was some unseen tie that was drawing us nearer and nearer together. And, strange to say, this has always happened just as my dreams of you have always come to me, when I have been separated from Van Brandt. At such times, thinking or dreaming, it has always appeared to me that I knew you far more familiarly than I know you when we meet face to face. Is there really such a thing, I wonder, as a former state of existence? And were we once constant companions in some other sphere, thousands of years since? These are idle guesses. Let it be enough for me to remember that I have been the better for knowing you, without inquiring how or why. Farewell, my beloved benefactor, my only friend. The child sends you a kiss, and the mother signs herself your grateful and affectionate M. Van Brandt." When I first read those lines, they once more recalled to my memory, very strangely, as I then thought, the predictions of Dame Dermody in the days of my boyhood. Here were the foretold sympathies which were spiritually to unite me to Mary, realized by a stranger whom I had met by chance in the later years of my life. Thinking in this direction, did I advance no further? Not a step further. Not a suspicion of the truth presented itself to my mind even yet. Was my own dullness of apprehension to blame for this? Would another man in my position have discovered what I had failed to see? I look back along the chain of events which runs through my narrative, and I ask myself, where are the possibilities to be found, in my case or in the case of any other man, of identifying the child who was Mary Dermody with the woman who was Mrs. Van Brandt? Was there anything left in our faces when we met again by the Scotch River to remind us of our younger selves? We had developed in the interval from boy and girl to man and woman. No outward traces were discernible in us of the George and Mary of other days. Disguised from each other by our faces, we were also disguised by our names. Her mock marriage had changed her surname. My stepfather's will had changed mine. Her Christian name was the commonest of all names in women, and mine was almost as far from being remarkable among the names of men. Turning next to the various occasions on which we had met, we had seen enough of each other to drift into recognition on either side, in the ordinary course of talk. We had met but 4 times in all, once on the bridge, once again in Edinburgh, twice more in London. On each of these occasions, the absorbing anxieties and interests of the passing moment had filled her mind and mine, had inspired her words and mine. When had the events which had brought us together left us with leisure enough and tranquillity enough to look back idly through our lives, and calmly to compare the recollections of our youth? Never! From first to last, the course of events had borne us further and further away from any results that could have been led to even a suspicion of the truth. She could only believe when she wrote to me on leaving England, and I could only believe when I read her letter, that we had first met at the river, and that our divergent destinies had ended in parting us forever. Reading her farewell letter in later days, by the light of my matured experience, I note how remarkably Dame Dermody's faith in the purity of the tie that united us as kindred spirits was justified by the result. It was only when my unknown Mary was parted from Van Brandt, in other words, it was only when she was a pure spirit, that she felt my influence over her as a refining influence on her life, and that the apparition of her communicated with me in the visible and perfect likeness of herself. On my side, when was it that I dreamed of her, as in Scotland, or felt the mysterious warning of her presence in my waking moments, as in Shetland? Always at the time when my heart opened most tenderly toward her and toward others, when my mind was most free from the bitter doubts, the self-seeking aspirations which degrade the divinity within us, then, and only then, my sympathy with her was the perfect sympathy which holds its fidelity unassailable by the chances and changes, the delusions and temptations of mortal life. I am writing prematurely of the time when the light came to me. My narrative must return to the time when I was still walking in darkness. Absorbed in watching over the closing days of my mother's life, I found in the performance of this sacred duty my only consolation under the overthrow of my last hope of marriage with Mrs. Van Brandt. By slow degrees, my mother felt the reviving influences of a quiet life and a soft, pure air. The improvement in her health could, as I but too well knew, be only an improvement for a time. Still, it was a relief to see her free from pain, and innocently happy in the presence of her son. Excepting those hours of the day and night which were dedicated to repose, I was never far away from her. To this day, I remember with a tenderness which attaches to no other memories of mine the books that I read to her, the sunny corner on the seashore where I sat with her, the games of cards that we played together, the little trivial gossip that amused her when she was strong enough for nothing else. These are my imperishable relics. These are the deeds of my life that I shall love best to look back on when the all enfolding shadows of death are closing round me. In the hours when I was alone, my thoughts, occupying themselves most among the persons and events of the past, wandered back many and many a time to Shetland and Miss Dunross. My haunting doubt as to what was the black veil that had really hidden from me was no longer accompanied by a feeling of horror when it now recurred to my mind. The more vividly my later remembrances of Miss Dunross were associated with the idea of unutterable bodily affliction, the higher the noble nature of the woman seemed to rise in my esteem. For the first time since I had left Shetland, the temptation now came to me to disregard the injunction which her father had laid upon me at parting. When I thought again of the stolen kiss in the dead of night, when I recalled the appearance of the frail white hand waving to me through the dark curtains its last farewell, and when there mingled with those memories the later remembrance of what my mother had suspected, and of what Mrs. Van Brandt had seen in her dream, the longing in me to find a means of assuring Miss Dunross that she still held her place apart in my memory and my heart was more than mortal fortitude could resist. I was pledged in honour not to return to Shetland, and not to write. How to communicate with her secretly, in some other way, was the constant question in my mind as the days went on. A hint to enlighten me was all I wanted, and, as the irony of circumstances ordered it, my mother was the person who gave me the hint. We still spoke at intervals of Mrs. Van Brandt, watching me on those occasions when we were in the company of friends and acquaintances at Torquay. My mother plainly discerned that no other woman, whatever her attractions might be, could take the place in my heart of the woman whom I had lost. Seeing but one prospect of happiness for me, she steadily refused to abandon the idea of my marriage. When a woman has owned that she loves a man, so my mother used to express her opinion, it is that man's fault, no matter what the obstacles might be, if he fails to make her his wife. Reverting to this view in various ways, she pressed it on my consideration one day in these words: "There is one drawback, George, to my happiness in being here with you. I am an obstacle in the way of your communicating with Mrs. Van Brandt." "You forget," I said, "that she has left England without telling me where to find her." "If you were free from the encumbrance of your mother, my dear, you would easily find her. Even as things are, you might surely write to her. Don't mistake my motives, George. If I had any hope of you forgetting her, if I saw you only moderately attracted by one or other of the charming women whom we both know here, I should say, let us never speak again or think again of Mrs. Van Brandt. But, my dear, your heart is closed to every woman but one. Be happy in your own way, and let me see it before I die. The wretch to whom that poor creature is sacrificing her life will, sooner or later, ill-treat her or desert her, and then she must turn to you. Don't let her think that you are resigned to the loss of her. The more resolutely you set your scruples at defiance, the more she will love you and admire you in secret. Women are like that. Send her a letter, and follow it with a little present. You talked of taking me to the studio of the young artist here who left his card the other day. Am I told that he paints admirable portraits and miniatures? Why not send your portrait to Mrs. Van Brandt? Here was the idea which I had been vainly in search. Quite superfluous as a method of pleading my cause with Mrs. Van Brandt, the portrait offered the best of all means of communicating with Miss Dunross without absolutely violating the engagement which her father had pledged me. In this way, without writing a word, without even sending a message, I might tell her how gratefully she was remembered, and I might remind her of me tenderly in the bitterest moments of her sad and solitary life. The same day I went to the artist privately. The sittings were afterward continued during the hours while my mother was resting in her room, until the portrait was completed. I caused it to be enclosed in a plain gold locket with a chain attached, and I forwarded my gift, in the first instance, to the one person I could trust to assist me in arranging for the conveyance of it to its destination. This was the old friend alluded to in those pages as Sir James, who had taken me with him to Shetland in the government yacht. I had no reason, in writing the necessary explanations, to express myself to Sir James with any reserve. On the voyage back, we had more than once spoken together confidentially of Miss Dunross. Sir James had heard her sad story from the resident medical man at LibriVox, who had been an old companion of his in their college days. Requesting him to confide my gift to this gentleman, I did not hesitate to acknowledge the doubt that oppressed me in relation to the mystery of the black veil. It was, of course, impossible to decide whether the doctor would be able to relieve that doubt. I could only venture to suggest that the question might be guardedly put in making the customary inquiries after the health of Miss Dunross. In those days of slow communication, I had to wait, not for days, but for weeks, before I could expect to receive Sir James's answer. His letter only reached me after an unusually long delay. For this, or for some other reason that I cannot divine, I felt so strongly the foreboding of bad news that I abstained from breaking the seal in my mother's presence. I waited until I could retire to my own room, and then I opened the letter. My presentiment had not deceived me. Sir James's reply contained these words only: "The letter enclosed tells its own sad story without help from me. I cannot grieve for her, but I can feel sorry for you." The letter thus described was addressed to Sir James by the doctor at LibriVox. I copy it without comment in these words: "The late stormy weather has delayed the vessel by means of which we communicate with the mainland. I have received your letter to-day. With it there has been arrived a little box containing a gold locket and chain, being the present which you ask me to convey privately to Miss Dunross, from a friend of yours whose name you are not at liberty to mention. In transmitting these instructions, you have innocently placed me in a position of extreme difficulty. The poor lady for whom the gift is intended is near the end of her life. a life of such complicated and terrible suffering that death comes, in her case, literally as a mercy and a deliverance. Under these melancholy circumstances, I am, I think, not to blame if I hesitate to give her the locket in secret, not knowing with what associations this keepsake may be connected, or of what serious agitation it may not possibly be the cause. In this state of doubt, I have ventured on opening the locket, and my hesitation is naturally increased. I am quite ignorant of the remembrances which my unhappy patient may connect with the portrait. I don't know whether it will give her pleasure or pain to receive it in her last moments on earth. I can only decide to take it with me when I see her tomorrow, and to let circumstances determine whether I shall risk letting her see it or not. Our post to the south only leaves this place in 3 days' time. I can keep my letter open and let you know the result. I have seen her, and I have just returned to my own house. My distress of mind is great, but I will do my best to write intelligibly and fully of what has happened. Her sinking energies, when I first saw her this morning, had rallied for the moment. The nurse informed me that she had slept during the early hours of the new day. Previously to this, there were symptoms of fever, accompanied by some slight delirium. The words that escaped her in this condition appear to have related mainly to an absent person whom she spoke of by the name of George. Her one anxiety, I am told, was to see George again before she died. Hearing this, it struck me as barely possible that the portrait in the locket might be the portrait of the absent person. I sent her nurse out of the room, and took her hand in mine, trusting partly to her own admirable courage and strength of mind, and partly to the confidence which I knew she placed in me as an old friend and adviser. I adverted to the words which had fallen from her in her feverish state, and then I said, "You know that any secret of yours is safe in my keeping. Tell me, do you expect to receive any little keepsake or memorial from George?" It was a risk to run. The black veil which she always wears was over her face. I had nothing to tell me of the effect which I was producing on her, except the changing temperature or the partial movement of her hand as it lay in mine, just under the silk coverlet of the bed. She said nothing at first. Her hand turned suddenly from cold to hot, and closed with a quick pressure on mine. Her breathing became oppressed. When she spoke, it was with difficulty. She told me nothing. She only put a question. "Is he here?" she asked. I said, "Nobody is here but myself." "Is there a letter?" I said, "No." She was silent for a while. Her hand turned cold. The grasp of her fingers loosened. She spoke again. "Be quick, doctor. Whatever it is, give it to me before I die." I risked the experiment. I opened the locket, and I put it into her hand. As far as I could discover, she refrained from looking at it at first. She said, "Turn me in the bed with my face to the wall." I obeyed her. With her back turned toward me, she lifted her veil, and then, as I suppose, she looked at the portrait. A long, low cry, not of sorrow or pain, a cry of rapture and delight, burst from her. I heard her kiss the portrait. Accustomed as I am in my profession to piteous sights and sounds, I never remember so completely losing my self-control as I lost it at that moment. I was obliged to turn away to the window. Hardly a minute could have passed before I was back at the bedside. In that brief interval she had changed. Her voice had sunk again. It was so weak, I could only hear what she said by leaning over her and placing my ear close to her lips. "Put it round my neck," she whispered. I clasped the chain of the locket round her neck. She tried to lift her hand to it, but her strength failed her. "Help me to hide it," she said. I guided her hand. She hid the locket in her bosom, under the white dressing gown which she wore that day. The oppression in her breathing increased. I raised her on the pillow. The pillow was not high enough. I rested her head on my shoulder. I partially opened her veil. She was able to speak once more, feeling a momentary relief. "Promise," she said, "that no stranger's hand shall touch me. Promise to bury me as I am now." I gave her my promise. Her failing breath quickened. She was just able to articulate the next word. "Cover my face again." I drew the veil over her face. She rested a while in silence. Suddenly the sound of her laboring respiration ceased. She started. She raised her head from my shoulder. "Are you in pain?" I asked. "Oh, I am in heaven," she answered. Her head dropped back on my breast as she spoke. In that last outburst of joy, her last breath had passed. The moment of her supreme happiness and the moment of her death were one. The mercy of God had found her at last. I return to my letter before the post goes out. I have taken the necessary measures for the performance of my promise. She will be buried with the portrait hidden in her bosom, with the black veil over her face. No nobler creature ever breathed the breath of life. Tell the stranger who sent her his portrait that her last moments were joyful moments, through his remembrance of her as expressed by his gift. I observe a passage in your letter to which I have not yet replied. You ask me if there was any more serious reason for the persistent hiding of her face under the veil than the reason which she was accustomed to give to the persons about her. It is true that she suffered under a morbid sensitiveness to the action of light. It is also true that this was not the only result, or the worst result, of the malady that affected her. She had another reason for keeping her face hidden, a reason known to only two persons, to the doctor who lives in the village near her father's house, and to myself. We are both pledged never to divulge to any living creature what our eyes alone have seen. We have kept our terrible secret even from her father, and we shall carry it with us to our graves. I have no more to say on this melancholy subject to the person whose interest you write. When he thinks of her now, let him think of the beauty which no bodily affliction can profane, the beauty of the freed spirit, eternally happy in its union with the angels of God. I may add, before I close my letter, that the poor old father will not be left in cheerless solitude at the lake house. He will pass the remainder of his days under my roof, with my good wife to take care of him, and my children to remind him of the brighter side of life. So the letter ended. I put it away and went out. The solitude of my room forewarned me unendurably of the coming solitude in my own life. My interests in this busy world were now narrowed to one object, to the care of my mother's failing health. Of the two women whose hearts had once beaten in loving sympathy with mine, one lay in her grave, and the other was lost to me in a foreign land. On the drive by the sea, I met my mother in her little pony chaise, moving slowly under the mild wintry sunshine. I dismissed the man who was in attendance on her, and I walked by the side of the chaise, with the reins in my hand. We chatted quietly on trivial subjects. I closed my eyes to the dreary future that was before me, and tried, in the intervals of heartache, to live resignedly in the passing hour. End of chapter 30. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Chapter 31 of the Two Destinies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Two Destinies by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 31. The Physician's Opinion. 6 months have elapsed. Summertime has come again. The last parting is over. Prolonged by my care, the days of my mother's life have come to their end. She has died in my arms. Her last words have been spoken to me. Her last look on earth has been mine. I am now, in the saddest and plainest meaning of the words, alone in the world. The affliction which has befallen me has left certain duties to be performed that require my presence in London. My house is let. I am staying at a hotel. My friend, Sir James, also in London on business, has rooms near mine. We breakfast and dine together in my sitting room. For the moment, solitude is dreadful to me, and yet I cannot go into society. I shrink from persons who are mere acquaintances. At Sir James's suggestion, however, one visitor at the hotel has been asked to dine with us, who claims distinction as no ordinary guest. The physician who first warned me of the critical state of my mother's health is anxious to hear what I can tell him of her last moments. His time is too precious to be wasted in the earlier hours of the day, and he wants to join us at the dinner table when his patients leave him free to visit his friends. The dinner is nearly at an end. I have made the effort to preserve my self-control, and in few words have told the simple story of my mother's last peaceful days on earth. The conversation turns next on topics of little interest to me. My mind rests after the effort that it has made. My observation is left free to exert itself as usual. Little by little, while the talk goes on, I observe something in the conduct of the celebrated physician which first puzzles me, and then arouses my suspicion of some motive for his presence which has not been acknowledged, and in which I am concerned. Over and over again, I discover that his eyes are resting on me with a furtive interest and attention which he seems anxious to conceal. Over and over again, I notice that he contrives to divert the conversation from general topics and to lure me into talking of myself, and, stranger still, unless I am quite mistaken, Sir James understands and encourages him. Under various pretenses, I am questioned about what I have suffered in the past, and what plans of life I have formed for the future. Among other subjects of personal interest to me, the subject of supernatural appearances is introduced. I am asked if I believe in occult spiritual sympathies and in ghostly apparitions of dead or distant persons. I am dexterously led into hinting that my views on this difficult and debatable question are in some degree influenced by experiences of my own. Hints, however, are not enough to satisfy the doctor's innocent curiosity. He tries to induce me to relate in detail what I have myself seen and felt, but by this time I am on my guard. I make excuses. I steadily abstain from taking my friend into my confidence. It is more and more plain to me that I am being made the subject of an experiment in which Sir James and the physician are equally interested. Outwardly assuming to be guiltless of any suspicion of what is going on, I inwardly determine to discover the true motive for the doctor's presence that evening, and for the part that Sir James has taken in inviting him to be my guest. Events favor my purpose soon after the dessert has been placed on the table. The waiter enters the room with a letter for me, and announces that the bearer waits to know if there is any answer. I open the envelope and find inside a few lines from my lawyers announcing the completion of some formal matter of business. I at once seize the opportunity that is offered to me. Instead of sending a verbal message downstairs, I make my apologies and use the letter as a pretext for leaving the room. Dismissing the messenger who waits below, I return to the corridor in which my rooms are situated, and softly open the door of my bedchamber. A second door communicates with the sitting room, and has a ventilator in the upper part of it. I have only to stand under the ventilator, and every word of the conversation between Sir James and the physician reaches my ears. "Then you think I am right," are the first words I hear in Sir James's voice. "Quite right," the doctor answers. "I have done my best to make him change his dull way of life," Sir James proceeds. "I have asked him to pay a visit to my house in Scotland. I have proposed travelling with him on the continent. I have offered to take him with me on my next voyage in the yacht. He has but one answer. He simply says no to everything that I can suggest. You have heard from his own lips that he has no definite plans for the future. What is to become of him? What had we better do?" "It is not easy to say," I hear the physician reply. "To speak plainly, the man's nervous system is seriously deranged. I noticed something strange in him when he first came to consult with me about his mother's health. The mischief has not been caused entirely by the affliction of her death. In my belief, his mind has been, what shall I say, unhinged for some time past. He is a very reserved person. I suspect he has been oppressed by anxieties which he has kept secret from everyone. At his age, the unacknowledged troubles of life are generally troubles caused by women. It is his temperament to take the romantic view of love, and some matter-of-fact woman of the present day may have bitterly disappointed him. Whatever may be the cause, the effect is plain. His nerves have broken down. His brain is necessarily affected by whatever affects his nerves. I have known men in his condition who have ended badly. He may drift into insane delusions if his present course of life is not altered. Did you hear what he said when he talked of ghosts?" "Sheer nonsense," Sir James remarks. "Sheer delusion would be the more correct form of expression," the doctor rejoins, "and other delusions may grow out of it at any moment." "What is to be done?" persists Sir James. I may really say for myself, doctor, that I feel a fatherly interest in the poor fellow. His mother was one of my oldest and dearest friends, and he has inherited many of her engaging and endearing qualities. I hope you don't think the case is bad enough to be a case for restraint. Certainly not as yet, answers the doctor. So far, there is no positive brain disease, and there is accordingly no sort of reason for placing him under restraint. It is essentially a difficult and doubtful case. Have him privately looked after by a competent person, and thwart him in nothing, if you can possibly help it. The merest trifle may excite his suspicions, and if that happens, we lose all control over him. You don't think he suspects us already, do you, doctor? I hope not. I saw him once or twice look at me very strangely, and he has certainly been a long time out of the room. Hearing this, I wait to hear no more. I return to the sitting room by way of the corridor and resume my place at the table. The indignation that I feel, naturally enough, I think, under the circumstances, makes a good actor of me for once in my life. I invent the necessary excuse for my long absence, and take my part in the conversation, keeping the strictest guard on every word that escapes me, without betraying any appearance of restraint in my manner. Early in the evening, the doctor leaves us to go to a scientific meeting. For half an hour or more, Sir James remains with me, by way, I suppose, of farther testing the state of my mind. He renews the invitation to his house in Scotland. I pretend to feel flattered by his anxiety to secure me as his guest. I undertake to reconsider my first refusal, and to give him a definite answer when we meet the next morning at breakfast. Sir James is delighted. We shake hands cordially and wish each other good night. At last, I am left alone. My resolution as to my next course of proceeding is formed without a moment's hesitation. I determine to leave the hotel privately the next morning, before Sir James is out of his bedroom. To what destination I am to betake myself is naturally the next question that arises, and this I also easily decide. During the last days of my mother's life, we spoke together frequently of the happy past days when we were living together on the banks of the Greenwater lake. The longing thus inspired to look once more at the old scenes, to live for a while again among the old associations, has grown on me since my mother's death. I have, happily for myself, not spoken of this feeling to Sir James or to any other person. When I am missed at the hotel, there will be no suspicion of the direction in which I have turned my steps. To the old home in Suffolk I resolve to go the next morning. Wandering among the scenes of my boyhood, I can consider with myself how I may best bear the burden of the life that lies before me. After what I have heard that evening, I confide in nobody. For all that I know to the contrary, my own servant may be employed tomorrow as the spy who watches my actions. When the man makes his appearance to take his orders for the night, I tell him to wake me at 6 the next morning, and release him from further attendance. I next employ myself in writing 2 letters. They will be left on the table to speak for themselves after my departure. In the first letter, I briefly inform Sir James that I have discovered his true reason for inviting the doctor to dinner, While I thank him for the interest he takes in my welfare, I decline to be made the object of any further medical inquiries as to the state of my mind. In due course of time, when my plans are settled, he will hear from me again. Meanwhile, he need feel no anxiety about my safety. It is one of my delusions to believe that I am still perfectly capable of taking care of myself. My second letter is addressed to the landlord of the hotel, and simply provides for the disposal of my luggage and the payment of my bill. I enter my bedroom next, and pack a traveling bag with a few things that I can carry with me. My money is in my dressing case. Opening it, I discover my pretty keepsake, the green flag. Can I return to Greenwater Broad? Can I look again at the bailiff's cottage without the one memorial of little Mary that I possess? Besides, have I not promised Miss Dunross that Mary's gift shall always go with me wherever I go? And is the promise not doubly sacred now that she is dead? For a while I sit idly looking at the device on the flag, the white dove embroidered on the green ground, with the golden olive branch in its beak. The innocent love story of my early life returns to my memory, and shows me in horrible contrast the life that I am leading now. I fold up the flag and place it carefully in my traveling bag. This done, all is done. I may rest till the morning comes. No. I lie down on my bed, and I discover that there is no rest for me that night. Now that I have no occupation to keep my energies employed, now that my first sense of triumph in the discomfiture of the friends who have plotted against me has had time to subside, my mind reverts to the conversation that I have overheard, and considers it from a new point of view. For the first time, the terrible question confronts me. The doctor's opinion on my case has been given very positively. How do I know the doctor is not right? This famous physician has risen to the head of his profession entirely by his own abilities. He is one of the medical men who succeed by means of an ingratiating manner and the dexterous handling of good opportunities. Even his enemies admit that he stands unrivaled in the art of separating the true conditions from the false, in the discovery of disease, and in tracing effects accurately to their distant and hidden cause. Is such a man of this likely to be mistaken about me? Is it not far more probable that I am mistaken in my judgment of myself? When I look back over the past years, am I quite sure that the strange events which I recall may not, in certain cases, be the visionary product of my own disordered brain, realities to me and to no one else? What are the dreams of Mrs. Van Brandt? What are the ghostly apparitions of her which I believe myself to have seen? Delusions which have been the steady growth of the years? Delusions which are leading me by slow degrees nearer and nearer to madness in the end? Is it insane suspicion which has made me so angry with the good friends who have been trying to save my reason? Is it insane terror which sets me on escaping from the hotel like a criminal escaping from prison? These are the questions which torment me when I am alone in the dead of night. My bed becomes a place of unendurable torture. I rise and dress myself and wait for the daylight looking through my open window into the street. The summer night is short. The gray light of dawn comes to me like a deliverance. The glow of the glorious sunrise cheers my soul once more. Why should I wait in the room that is still haunted by my horrible doubts of the night? I take up my traveling bag. I leave my letters on the sitting room table, and I descend the stairs to the house door. The night porter at the hotel is slumbering in his chair. He wakes as I pass him, and, God help me, he too looks as if he thought I was mad. "Going to leave us already, sir?" he says, looking at the bag in my hand. Mad or sane, I am ready with my reply. I tell him I am going out for a day in the country, and to make it a long day, I must start early. The man still stares at me. He asks if he shall find someone to carry my bag. I decline to let anybody be disturbed. He inquires if I have any messages to leave for my friend. I inform him that I have left written messages upstairs for Sir James and the landlord. Upon this, he draws the bolts and opens the door. To the last, he looks at me as if he thought I was mad. Was he right or wrong? Who can answer for himself? How can I tell? End of chapter 31. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Chapter 32 of The Two Destinies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Two Destinies by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 32. A Last Look at Greenwater Broad. My spirits rose as I walked through the bright empty streets and breathed the fresh morning air. Taking my way eastward through the great city, I stopped at the first office that I passed, and secured my place by the early coach to Ipswich. Thence I travelled with post horses to the market town, which was nearest to Greenwater Broad. A walk of a few miles in the cool evening brought me, through well-remembered by-roads, to our old house. By the last rays of the setting sun, I looked at the familiar row of windows in front, and saw that the shutters were all closed. Not a living creature was visible anywhere. Not even a dog barked as I rang the great bell at the door. The place was deserted. The house was shut up. After a long delay, I heard heavy footsteps in the hall. An old man opened the door. Changed as he was, I remembered him as one of our tenants in the bygone time. To his astonishment, I greeted him by his name. On his side, he tried hard to recognize me, and tried in vain. No doubt I was the more sadly changed of the two. I was obliged to introduce myself. The poor fellow's withered face brightened slowly and timidly, as if he were half incapable, half afraid, of indulging in the unaccustomed luxury of a smile. In his confusion he bid me welcome home again, as if the house had been mine. Taking me into the little back room which he inhabited, the old man gave me all he had to offer, a supper of bacon and eggs, and a glass of home-brewed beer. He was evidently puzzled to understand me when I informed him that the only object of my visit was to look once more at the familiar scenes round my old home. But he willingly placed his services at my disposal, and he engaged to do his best, if I wished it, to make me up a bed for the night. The house had been closed, and the establishment of servants had been dismissed for more than a year past. A passion for horse racing, developed late in life, had ruined the rich retired tradesman who had purchased the estate at the time of our family troubles. He had gone abroad with his wife to live on the little income that had been saved from the wreck of his fortune, and he had left the house and lands in such a state of neglect that no new purchaser had thus far been found to take them. My old friend, now past his work, had been put in charge of the place. As for Dermody's cottage, it was empty. Like the house, I was at perfect liberty to look over it if I liked. There was the key of the door on the bunch with the others, and here was the old man, with his old hat on his head, ready to accompany me wherever I pleased to go. I declined to trouble him to accompany me or to make up a bed in the lonely house. The night was fine, the moon was rising. I had supped, I had rested. When I had seen what I wanted to see, I could easily walk back to the market town and sleep at the inn. Taking the key in my hand, I set forth alone on the way through the grounds which led to Dermody's cottage. Again I followed the woodland paths, along which I had once idled so happily with my little Mary. At every step I saw something that reminded me of her. Here was the rustic bench on which we had sat together under the shadow of the old cedar tree, and vowed to be constant to each other to the end of our lives. There was the bright little water spring from which we drank when we were weary and thirsty in sultry summer days, still bubbling its way downward to the lake as cheerily as ever. As I listened to the companionable murmur of the stream, I almost expected to see her again, in her simple white frock and straw hat, singing to the music of the rivulet and freshening her nosegay of wild flowers by dipping it in the cool water. A few steps further on, and I reached a clearing in the wood, and stood on a little promontory of rising ground which commanded the prettiest view of Greenwater Lake. A platform of wood was built out from the bank to be used for bathing by good swimmers who were not afraid of a plunge into deep water. I stood on the platform and looked round me. The trees that fringed the shore on either hand murmured their sweet sylvan music in the night air. The moonlight trembled softly on the rippling water. Away on my right hand I could just see the old wooden shed that once sheltered my boat in the days when Mary went sailing with me and worked the green flag. On my left was the wooden paling that followed the curves of the winding creek, and beyond it rose the brown arches of the decoy for wild fowl, now falling to ruin for want of use. Guided by the radiant moonlight, I could see the very spot on which Mary and I had stood to watch the snaring of the ducks, through the hole in the paling before which the decoy dog had shown himself. At Dermody's signal, a water-rat now passed, like a little black shadow on the bright ground, and was lost in the waters of the lake. Look where I might, the happy bygone time looked back in mockery, and the voices of the past came to me with their burden of reproach. See where your life was once? Is your life worth living now? I picked up a stone and threw it into the lake. I watched the circling ripples round the place at which it had sunk. I wondered if a practised swimmer like myself had ever tried to commit suicide by drowning, and had been so resolute to die that he had resisted the temptation to let his own skill keep him from sinking. Something in the lake itself, or something in connection with the thought that it had put into my mind, revolted me. I turned my back suddenly on the lonely view, and took the path through the wood which led to the bailiff's cottage. Opening the door with my key, I groped my way into the well-remembered parlour, and unbarring the window shutters, I let in the light of the moon. With a heavy heart I looked round me. The old furniture, renewed, perhaps, in one or two places, asserted its mute claim to my recognition in every part of the room. The tender moonlight streamed slanting into the corner in which Mary and I used to nestle together, while Dame Dermody was at the window reading her mystic books. Overshadowed by the obscurity in the opposite corner, I discovered the high-backed armchair of carved wood in which the Sibyl of the cottage sat on the memorable day when she warned us of our coming separation, and gave us her blessing for the last time. Looking next round the walls of the room, I recognized old friends wherever my eyes happened to rest. The gaudily coloured prints, the framed pictures in fine needlework, which we thought wonderful efforts of art, the old circular mirror to which I used to lift Mary when she wanted to see her face in the glass. Whenever the moonlight penetrated there, it showed me some familiar object that recalled my happiest days. Again the bygone time looked back in mockery. Again the voices of the past came to me with their burden of reproach. See what your life was once? Is your life worth living now? I sat down at the window, where I could just discover, here and there between the trees, the glimmer of the waters of the lake. I thought to myself, thus far my mortal journey has brought me. Why not end it here? Who would grieve for me if my death were reported tomorrow? Of all living men, I had perhaps the smallest number of friends, the fewest duties to perform toward others, the least reason to hesitate at leaving a world which had no place in it for my ambition, no creature in it for my love. Besides, what necessity was there for letting it be known that my death was a death of my own seeking? It could easily be left to represent itself as a death by accident. On that fine summer night, and after a long day of traveling, might I not naturally take a bath in the cool water before I went to bed? And, practiced as I was in the exercise of swimming, might it not nevertheless be my misfortune to be attacked by cramp? On the lonely shores of Greenwater Broad, the cry of a drowning man would bring no help at night. The fatal accident would explain itself. There was literally but one difficulty in the way, the difficulty which had already occurred to my mind. Could I sufficiently master the animal instinct of self-preservation to deliberately let myself sink at the first plunge? The atmosphere in the room felt close and heavy. I went out and walked to and fro, now in the shadow and now in the moonlight, under the trees before the cottage door. Of the moral objections to suicide, not one had any influence over me now. I, who had once found it impossible to excuse, impossible even to understand, the despair which had driven Mrs. Van Brandt to attempt self-destruction, I now contemplated, with composure, the very act which had horrified me when I saw it committed by another person. Well may we hesitate to condemn the frailties of our fellow creatures, for the one unanswerable reason that we can never feel sure how soon similar temptations may not lead us to be guilty of the same frailties ourselves. Looking back at the events of the night, I can recall but one consideration that stayed my feet on the fatal path which led back to the lake. I still doubted whether it would be possible for such a swimmer as I was to drown myself. This was all that troubled my mind. For the rest, my will was made, and I had few other affairs which remained unsettled. No lingering hope was left in me of a reunion in the future with Mrs. Van Brandt. She had never written to me again. I had forgiven her for having forgotten me. My thoughts of her and of others were the forbearing thoughts of a man whose mind was withdrawn already from the world, whose views were narrowing fast to the one idea of his own death. I grew weary of walking up and down. The loneliness of the place began to oppress me. The sense of my own indecision irritated my nerves. After a long look at the lake through the trees, I came to a positive conclusion at last. I determined to try if a good swimmer could drown himself. The end of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of the Two Destinies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Two Destinies by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 33. A Vision of the Night. Returning to the cottage parlor, I took a chair by the window and opened my pocketbook at a blank page. I had certain directions to give to my representatives, which might spare them some trouble and uncertainty in the event of my death. Disguising my last instructions under the commonplace heading of Memoranda on my return to London, I began to write. I had filled one page of the pocketbook and had just turned to the next, when I became conscious of a difficulty in fixing my attention on the subject that was before it. I was at once reminded of the similar difficulty which I felt in Shetland, when I had tried vainly to arrange the composition of the letter to my mother which Miss Dunross was to write. By way of completing the parallel, my thoughts wandered now, as they had wandered then, to my latest remembrance of Mrs. Van Brandt. In a minute or two I began to feel once more the strange physical sensations which I had first experienced in the garden at Mr. Dunrose's house. The same mysterious trembling shuddered through me from head to foot. I looked about me again, with no distinct consciousness of what the objects were on which my eyes rested. My nerves trembled on that lovely summer night, as if there had been an electric disturbance in the atmosphere, and a storm coming. I laid my pocket-book and pencil on the table, and rose to go out again under the trees. Even the trifling effort to cross the room was an effort made in vain. I stood rooted to the spot, with my face turned toward the moonlight streaming in at the open door. An interval passed, and as I still looked out through the door, I became aware of something moving far down among the trees that fringed the shore of the lake. The first impression produced on me was of two grey shadows winding their way slowly toward me between the trunks of the trees. By fine degrees the shadows assumed a more and more marked outline, until they presented themselves in the likeness of two robed figures, one taller than the other. While they glided nearer and nearer, their grey obscurity of hue melted away. They brightened softly with an inner light of their own as they slowly approached the open space before the door. For the third time I stood in the ghostly presence of Mrs. Van Brandt, and with her, holding her hand, I beheld a second apparition never before revealed to me, the apparition of her child. Hand in hand, shining in their unearthly brightness through the bright moonlight itself, the two stood before me. The mother's face looked at me once more with the sorrowful and pleading eyes which I remembered so well. But the face of the child was innocently radiant with an angelic smile. I waited in unutterable expectation for the word that was to be spoken, for the movement that was to come. The movement came first. The child released its hold on the mother's hand, and floating slowly upward, remained poised in mid-air, a softly glowing presence shining out of the dark background of the trees. The mother glided into the room, and stopped at the table on which I had laid my pocket-book and pencil when I could no longer write. As before, she took the pencil and wrote on the blank page. As before, she beckoned to me to step nearer to her. I approached her outstretched hand, and felt once more the mysterious rapture of her touch on my bosom, and heard once more her low, melodious tones repeating the words, "Remember me, come to me." Her hand dropped from my bosom. The pale light which revealed her to me quivered, sunk, vanished. She had spoken. She had gone. I drew to me the open pocket-book, and this time I saw, in the writing of the ghostly hand, these words only, "Follow the child." I looked out again at the lonely night landscape. There in mid-air, shining softly out of the dark background of the trees, still hovered the starry apparition of the child. Advancing without conscious will of my own, I crossed the threshold of the door. The softly glowing vision of the child moved away before me among the trees. I followed, like a man spellbound. The apparition, floating slowly onward, led me out of the wood, and past my old home, back to the lonely by-road along which I had walked from the market town to the house. From time to time, as we two went on our way, the bright figure of the child paused, hovering low in the cloudless sky. Its radiant face looked down smiling on me. It beckoned me with its little hand, and floated on again, leading me as the star led the eastern sages in the olden time. I reached the town. The airy figure of the child paused, hovering over the house at which I had left my travelling carriage in the evening. I ordered the horses to be harnessed again for another journey. The postilion waited for his further directions. I looked up. The child's hand was pointing southward along the road that led to London. I gave the man his instructions to return to the place at which I had hired the carriage. At intervals, as we proceeded, I looked out through the window. The bright figure of the child still floated on before me, gliding low in the cloudless sky. Changing the horses stage by stage, I went on till the night ended, went on till the sun rose in the eastern heaven, and still, whether it was dark or whether it was light, the figure of the child floated on before me in its changeless and mystic light. Mile after mile it still led the way southward, till we left the country behind us, and passing through the din and turmoil of the great city, stopped under the shadow of the ancient tower, within view of the river that runs by it. The postilion came to the carriage door to ask if I had further need of his services. I had called to him to stop, when I saw the figure of the child pause on its airy course. I looked upward again. The child's hand pointed toward the river. I paid the postilion and left the carriage. Floating on before me, the child led the way to a wharf crowded with travellers and their luggage. A vessel lay alongside of the wharf ready to sail. The child led me on board the vessel and paused again, hovering over me in the smoky air. I looked up. The child looked back at me with its radiant smile, and pointed eastward down the river toward the distant sea. While my eyes were still fixed on the softly glowing figure, I saw it fade away upward and upward into the higher light, as the lark vanishes upward and upward in the morning sky. I was alone again with my earthly fellow beings, left with no clue to guide me but the remembrance of the child's hand pointing eastward to the distant sea. A sailor was near me coiling the loosened mooring rope on the deck. I asked him to what port the vessel was bound. The man looked at me in surly amazement and answered, "To Rotterdam." End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of the Two Destinies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Two Destinies by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 34 by Land and Sea. It mattered little to me what port the vessel was bound. Go where I might, I knew I was on my way to Mrs. Van Brandt. She had need of me again. She had claimed me again. Where the visionary hand of the child had pointed, thither I was destined to go. Abroad or at home, it mattered nothing. When I next set my foot on the land, I should be further directed on the journey which lay before me. I believed this as firmly as I believed that I had been guided thus far by the vision of the child. For 2 nights I had not slept. My weariness overpowered me. I descended to the cabin and found an unoccupied corner in which I could lie down to rest. When I awoke, it was night already, and the vessel was at sea. I went on deck to breathe the fresh air. Before long, the sensation of drowsiness returned. I slept again for hours together. My friend, the physician, would no doubt have attributed this prolonged need of repose to the exhausted condition of my brain, previously excited by delusions which had lasted uninterruptedly for many hours together. Let the cause be what it might, during the greater part of the voyage I was awake at intervals only. The rest of the time I lay like a weary animal, lost in sleep. When I stepped on shore at Rotterdam, my first proceeding was to ask my way to the English consulate. I had but a small sum of money with me, and, for all I knew to the contrary, it might be well, before I did anything else, to take the necessary measures for replenishing my purse. I had my travelling bag with me. On the journey to Greenwater Broad, I had left it at the inn in the market town, and the waiter had placed it in the carriage when I started on my return to London. The bag contained my cheque-book and certain letters which assisted me in proving my identity to the consul. He kindly gave the necessary introduction to the correspondence at Rotterdam of my bankers in London. Having obtained my money, and having purchased certain necessaries of which I stood in need, I walked slowly along the street, knowing nothing of what my next proceeding was to be, and waiting confidently for the event which was to guide me. I had not walked 100 yards before I noticed the name of Van Brandt inscribed on the window blinds of a house which appeared to be devoted to mercantile purposes. The street door stood open. A second door, on one side of the passage, led into the office. I entered the room and inquired for Mr. Van Brandt. A clerk who spoke English was sent for to communicate with me. He told me there were 3 partners of that name in the business, and inquired which of them I wished to see. I remembered Van Brandt's Christian name, and mentioned it. No such person as Mr. Ernest Van Brandt was known at the office. "We are only the branch house of the firm of Van Brandt here," the clerk explained. "The head office is at Amsterdam. They may know where Mr. Ernest Van Brandt is to be found, if you inquire there." It mattered nothing to me where I went, so long as I was on my way to Mrs. Van Brandt. It was too late to travel that day. I slept at a hotel. The night passed quietly and uneventfully. The next morning I set forth by the public conveyance for Amsterdam. Repeating my inquiries at the head office on my arrival, I was referred to one of the partners in the firm. He spoke English perfectly, and he received me with an appearance of interest, which I was at a loss to account for at first. "Mr. Ernest Van Brandt is well known to me," he said. "May I ask if you are a relative or friend of the English lady who has been introduced here as his wife?" I answered in the affirmative, adding, "I am here to give any assistance to the lady of which she may stand in need." The merchant's next words explained the appearance of interest with which he had received me. "You are most welcome," he said. "You relieve my partners and myself of a great anxiety. I can only explain what I mean by referring for a moment to the business affairs of my firm. We have a fishing establishment in the ancient city of XXXIX, on the shores of the Zuider Zee. Mr. Ernest Van Brandt had a share in it at one time, which he afterwards sold. Of late years, our profits from this source have been diminishing, and we think of giving up the fishery, unless our prospects in that quarter improve after a further trial. In the meantime, having a vacant situation in the counting house at XXXIX, we sought of Mr. Ernest Van Brandt, and offered him the opportunity of renewing his connection with us, in the capacity of a clerk. He is related to one of my partners, but I am bound in truth to tell you that he is a very bad man. He has awarded us for our kindness to him by embezzling our money, and he has taken to flight, in what direction we have not yet discovered. The English lady and her child are left deserted at XXXIX, and until you came here today, we were quite at a loss to know what to do with them. I don't know whether you are already aware of it, sir, but the lady's position is made doubly distressing by doubts which we entertain of her really being Mr. Ernest Van Brandt's wife. To our certain knowledge, he was privately married to another woman some years since, and we have no evidence whatsoever that the first wife is dead. If we can help you in any way to assist your unfortunate countrywoman, pray believe that our services are at your disposal." With what breathless interest I listened to these words, it is needless to say Van Brandt had deserted her. Surely, as my poor mother had once said, she must turn to me now. The hopes that had abandoned me filled my heart once more. The future, which I had so long feared to contemplate, showed itself again bright with the promise of coming happiness to my view. I thanked the good merchant with a fervor that surprised him. "Only help me find my way to XXXIX," I said, "and I will answer for the rest." "The journey will put you to some expense," the merchant replied. "Pardon me if I ask the question bluntly. Have you money?" "Plenty of money." "Very good. The rest will be easy enough. I will place you under the care of a countryman of yours, who has been employed in our office for many years. The easiest way for you, as a stranger, will be to go by sea, and the Englishman will show you where to hire a boat." In a few moments more, the clerk and I were on our way to the harbor. Difficulties which I had not anticipated occurred in finding the boat and in engaging a crew. This done, it was next necessary to purchase provisions for the voyage. Thanks to the experience of my companion, and to the hearty goodwill with which he exerted it, my preparations were completed before nightfall. I was able to set sail for my destination on the next day. The boat had the double advantage in navigating the Zuyder Zee of being large and of drawing very little water. The captain's cabin was at the stern, and the 2 or 3 men who formed his crew were berthed forward in the bows. The whole middle of the boat, partitioned off on the one side and on the other from the captain and the crew, was assigned to me for my cabin. Under these circumstances, I had no reason to complain of want of space, the vessel measuring between 50 and 60 tons. I had a comfortable bed, a table, and chairs. The kitchen was well away from me in the forward part of the boat. At my own request, I set forth on the voyage without servant or interpreter. I preferred being alone. The Dutch captain had been employed at a former period of his life in the mercantile navy of France, and we could communicate, whenever it was necessary or desirable, in the French language. We left the spires of Amsterdam behind us, and sailed over the smooth waters of the lake on our way to the Zuyder Zee. The history of this remarkable sea is a romance in itself. In the days when Rome was mistress of the world, it had no existence. Where the waves now roll, vast tracts of forest surrounded a great inland lake, but with one river to serve it as an outlet to the sea. Swelled by a succession of tempests, the lake overflowed its boundaries. Its furious waters, destroying every obstacle in their course, rested only when they reached the furthest limits of the land. The northern ocean beyond burst its way in through the gaps of ruin, and from that time the Zuyder Zee existed as we know it now. The years advanced, the generations of man succeeded each other, and on the shores of the new ocean there rose great and populous cities, rich in commerce, renowned in history. For centuries their prosperity lasted, before the next in this mighty series of changes ripened and revealed itself, isolated from the rest of the world, vain of themselves and their good fortune, careless of the march of progress in the nations round them. The inhabitants of the Zuyder Zee cities sunk into the fatal torpor of a secluded people. The few members of the population who still preserved the relics of their old energy emigrated, while the mass left behind resignedly witnessed the diminution of their commerce and the decay of their institutions. As the years advanced to the 19th century, the population was reckoned by hundreds, where it had once numbered by thousands. Trade disappeared. Whole streets were left desolate. Harbors, once filled with shipping, were destroyed by the unresisted accumulation of sand. In our own times, the decay of these once flourishing cities is so completely beyond remedy that the next great change in contemplation is the draining of the now dangerous and useless tract of water and the profitable cultivation of the reclaimed land by generations that are still to come. Such, briefly told, is the strange story of the Zuiderzee. As we advanced on our voyage and left the river, I noticed the tawny hue of the sea, caused by sand banks which color the shallow water and which make the navigation dangerous to inexperienced seamen. We found our moorings for the night at the fishing island of Marken, a low, lost, desolate-looking place, as I saw it after the last gleams of the twilight. Here and there, the gabled cottages perched on hillocks rose black against the dim, gray sky. Here and there, a human figure appeared at the waterside, standing fixed in contemplation of the strange boat, and that was all I saw of the island of Marken. Lying awake in the still night, alone on a strange sea, there were moments when I found myself beginning to doubt the reality of my own position. Was it all a dream? My thoughts of suicide, my vision of the mother and daughter, my journey back to the metropolis led by the apparition of the child, my voyage to Holland, my night anchorage in the unknown sea. Were these, so to speak, all pieces of the same morbid mental puzzle, all delusions from which I might wake at any moment and find myself restored to my senses again in the hotel at London? Bewildered by doubts which led me further and further from any definite conclusion, I left my bed and went on deck to change the scene. It was a still and cloudy night. In the black void around me, the island was a blacker shadow yet, and nothing more. The one sound that reached my ears was the heavy breathing of the captain and his crew sleeping on either side of me. I waited, looking round and round the circle of darkness in which I stood. No new vision showed itself. When I returned again to the cabin and slumbered at last, no dreams came to me. All that was mysterious, all that was marvelous in the later events of my life seemed to have been left behind me in England. Once in Holland, my course had been influenced by circumstances which were perfectly natural, by commonplace discoveries which might have revealed themselves to any man in my position. What did this mean? Had my gifts as a seer of visions departed from me in the new land and among the strange people? Or had my destiny led me to the place at which the troubles of my mortal pilgrimage were to find their end? Who could say? Early the next morning, we set sail once more. Our course was nearly northward. On one side of me was the tawny sea, changing under certain conditions of the weather to a dull pearl gray. On the other side was the flat, winding coast, composed alternately of yellow sand and bright green meadowlands, diversified at intervals by towns and villages, whose red tiled roofs and quaint church steeples rose gaily against the clear blue sky. the captain suggested to me to visit the famous towns of Edam and Horn, but I declined to go on shore. My one desire was to reach the ancient city in which Mrs. Van Brandt had been left deserted. As we altered our course to make for the promontory on which the XXXIX is situated, the wind fell, then shifted to another quarter, and blew with a force which greatly increased the difficulties of navigation. I still insisted, as long as it was possible to do so, on holding on our course. After sunset, the strength of the wind abated. The night came without a cloud, and the starry firmament gave us its pale and glittering light. In an hour more, the capricious wind shifted back again in our favor. Toward 10 o'clock, we sailed into the desolate harbor of XXXIX. The captain and crew, fatigued by their exertions, ate their frugal suppers and went to their beds. In a few minutes more, I was the only person left awake in the boat. I ascended to the deck and looked about me. Our boat was moored to a deserted quay. Excepting a few fishing vessels visible near us, the harbor of this once prosperous place was a vast solitude of water, varied here and there by dreary banks of sand. Looking inland, I saw the lonely buildings of the dead city, black, grim, and dreadful, under the mysterious starlight. Not a human creature, not even a stray animal, was to be seen anywhere. The place might have been desolated by a pestilence, so empty and so lifeless did it appear now. Little more than 100 years ago, the record of its population reached 60,000. The inhabitants had dwindled to 1/10 of that number when I looked at XXXIX now. I considered with myself what my next course of proceeding was to be. The chances were certainly against my discovering Mrs. Van Brandt if I ventured alone and unguided into the city at night. On the other hand, now that I had reached the place in which she and her child were living, friendless and deserted, could I patiently wait through the weary interval that must elapse before morning came and the town was astir? I knew my own self-tormenting disposition too well to accept this latter alternative. Whatever came of it, I determined to walk through XXXIX on the bare chance of meeting someone who might inform me of Mrs. Van Brandt's address. First, taking the precaution of locking my cabin door, I stepped from the bulwark of the vessel to the lonely quay, and set forth upon my night wanderings through the dead city. End of chapter 34. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Chapter 35 of the Two Destinies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Two Destinies by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 35. Under the window. I set the position of the harbor by my pocket compass, and then followed the course of the first street that lay before me. On either side, as I advanced, the desolate old houses frowned on me. There were no lights in the windows, no lamps in the streets. For a quarter of an hour at least, I penetrated deeper and deeper into the city without encountering a living creature on my way, with only the starlight to guide me. Turning by chance into a street broader than the rest, I at last saw a moving figure just visible ahead under the shadows of the houses. I quickened my pace and found myself following a man in the dress of a peasant. Hearing my footsteps behind him, he turned and looked at me. Discovering that I was a stranger, he lifted a thick cudgel that he carried with him and shook it threateningly, and called to me in his own language, as I gathered by his actions, to stand back. A stranger in XXXIX at that time of night was evidently reckoned as a robber in the estimation of this citizen. I had learned on the voyage from the captain of the boat how to ask my way in Dutch if I happened to be by myself in a strange town, and now I repeated my lesson, asking my way to the fishing office of Messrs. Van Brandt. Either my foreign accent made me unintelligible, or the man's suspicions disinclined him to trust me. Again he shook his cudgel, and again he signed me to stand back. It was useless to persist. I crossed to the opposite side of the way, and soon afterward lost sight of him under the portico of a house. Still following the windings of the deserted streets, I reached what I at first supposed to be the end of the town. Before me, for half a mile or more, as well as I could guess, rose a tract of meadowland, with sheep dotted over it at intervals, reposing for the night. I advanced over the grass, and observed here and there, where the ground rose a little, some mouldering fragments of brickwork. Looking onward as I reached the middle of the meadow, I perceived on its further side, towering, gaunt, and black in the night, a lofty arch or gateway, without walls at its sides, without a neighboring building of any sort, far or near. This, as I afterward learned, was one of the ancient gates of the city. The walls, crumbling to ruin, had been destroyed as useless obstacles that cumbered the ground. On the waste meadowland round me had once stood shops of the richest merchants, palaces of the proudest nobles of North Holland. I was actually standing on what had been formerly the wealthy quarter of XXXIX. And what was left of it now? A few mounds of broken bricks, a pasture land of sweet-smelling grass, and a little flock of sheep sleeping. The mere desolation of the view, apart altogether from its history, struck me with a feeling of horror. My mind seemed to lose its balance in the dreadful stillness that was round me. I felt unutterable forebodings of calamities to come. For the first time, I repented having left England. My thoughts turned regretfully to the woody shores of Greenwater Broad. If only I'd held to my resolution, I might have been at rest now in the deep waters of the lake. For what had I lived and planned and travelled since I left Dermody's cottage? Perhaps only to find that I had lost the woman whom I had loved, and now I was in the same town with her. Regaining the outer rows of the houses still left standing, I looked about me, intending to return by the street which was known to me already. Just as I thought I had discovered it, I noticed another living creature in the solitary city. A man was standing at the door of one of the outermost houses on my right hand. looking at me. At the risk of meeting with another rough reception, I determined to make a last effort to discover Mrs. Van Brandt before I returned to the boat. Seeing that I was approaching him, the stranger met me midway. His dress and manner showed plainly that I had not encountered this time a person of the lower ranks of life. He answered my question civilly in his own language. Seeing that I was at a loss to understand what he said, he invited me by signs to follow him. After walking for a few minutes in a direction which was quite new to me, we stopped in a gloomy little square, with a plot of neglected garden ground in the middle of it, pointing to a lower window in one of the houses, in which a light dimly appeared. My guide said in Dutch, "Office of Van Brandt, sir," bowed and left me. I advanced to the window. It was open, and it was just high enough to be above my head. The light in the room found its way outward through the interstices of closed wooden shutters. Still haunted by misgivings of trouble to come, I hesitated to announce my arrival precipitately by ringing the house bell. How did I know what new calamity may not confront me when the door was opened? I waited under the window and listened. Hardly a minute passed before I heard a woman's voice in the room. There was no mistaking the charm of those tones. It was the voice of Mrs. Van Brandt. "Come, darling," she said. "It is very late. You ought to have been in bed 2 hours ago." The child's voice answered, "I am not sleepy, mamma." "But, my dear, remember you have been ill. You may be ill again if you keep out of bed so late as this. Only lie down, and you will soon fall asleep when I put the candle out." "You must not put the candle out," the child returned with strong emphasis. "My new papa is coming. How is he to find his way to us if you put out the light?" The mother answered sharply, as though the child's strange words irritated her. "You are talking nonsense," she said, "and you must go to bed. Mr. Germaine knows nothing about us. Mr. Germaine is in England." I could restrain myself no longer. I called out under the window, "Mr. Germaine is here." End of chapter 35. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Chapter 36 of the Two Destinies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Two Destinies by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 36. Love and Pride. A cry of terror from the room told me that I had been heard. For a moment nothing more happened. Then the child's voice reached me, wild and shrill. "Open the shutters, mamma! I said he was coming. I want to see him." There was an interval of hesitation before the mother opened the shutters. She did it at last. I saw her darkly at the window, with the light behind her, and the child's head just visible above the lower part of the window frame. The quaint little face moved rapidly up and down, as if my self-appointed daughter were dancing for joy. "Can I trust my own senses?" said Mrs. Van Brandt. "Is it really, Mr. Germaine?" "How do you do, new papa?" cried the child. "Push open the big door and come in. I want to kiss you." There was a world of difference between the coldly doubtful tone of the mother and the joyous greeting of the child. Had I forced myself too suddenly on Mrs. Van Brandt? Like all sensitively organized persons, she possessed that inbred sense of self-respect, which is pride under another name. Was her pride wounded at the bare idea of my seeing her, deserted as well as deceived, abandoned contemptuously, a helpless burden on strangers, by the man for whom she had sacrificed and suffered so much, and that man a thief, flying from the employers whom he had cheated? I pushed open the heavy oaken street door, fearing that this might be the true explanation of the change which I had already remarked in her. My apprehensions were confirmed when she unlocked the inner door leading from the courtyard to the sitting-room, and let me in. As I took her by both hands and kissed her, she turned her head so that my lips touched her cheek only. She flushed deeply. Her eyes looked away from me as she spoke her few formal words of welcome. When the child flew into my arms, she cried out irritably, "Don't trouble Mr. Germaine." I took a chair, with the little one on my knee. Mrs. Van Brandt seated herself at a distance from me. "It is needless, I suppose, to ask you if you know what has happened," she said, turning pale again as suddenly she had turned red, keeping her eyes fixed obstinately on the floor. Before I could answer, the child burst out with the news of her father's disappearance in these words: "My other papa has run away. My other papa has stolen money. It's time I had a new one, isn't it?" She put her arms round my neck. "And now I've got him," she cried at the shrillest pitch of her voice. The mother looked at us. For a while the proud, sensitive woman struggled successfully with herself. But the pang that wrung her was not to be endured in silence. With a low cry of pain, she hid her face in her hands. Overwhelmed by the sense of her own degradation, she was even ashamed to let the man who loved her see that she was in tears. I took the child off my knee. There was a second door in the sitting-room, which happened to be left open. It showed me a bedchamber within, and a candle burning on the toilette table. "Go in there and play," I said. I want to talk to your mamma." The child pouted. My proposal did not appear to tempt her. "Give me something to play with," she said. "I'm tired of my toys. Let me see what you have to play with in your pockets." Her busy little hands began to search in my coat pockets. I let her take what she pleased, and so bribed her to run away into the inner room. As soon as she was out of sight, I approached the poor mother and seated myself at her side. "Think of it as I do," I said. "Now that he has forsaken you, he has left you free to be mine." She lifted her head instantly. Her eyes flashed through her tears. "Now that he has forsaken me," she answered, "I am more unworthy of you than ever." "Why?" I asked. "Why?" she repeated passionately. "Has a woman not reached the lowest depths of degradation when she has lived to be deserted by a thief?" It was hopeless to attempt to reason with her in her present frame of mind. I tried to attract her attention to a less painful subject by referring to the strange succession of events which had brought me to her for the third time. She stopped me impatiently at the outset. "It seems useless to say once more what we have said on other occasions," she answered. "I understand what has brought you here. I have appeared to you again in a vision, just as I appeared to you twice before." "No," I said, "not as you appeared to me twice before. This time I saw you with the child by your side." That reply roused her. She started and looked nervously toward the bedchamber door. "Don't speak loud," she said. "Don't let the child hear us. My dream of you this time has left a painful impression on my mind. The child is mixed up in it, and I don't like that. And the place in which I saw you is associated." She paused, leaving this sentence unfinished. "I am nervous and wretched tonight," she resumed, "and I don't want to speak of it, and yet I should like to know whether my dream has misled me, or whether you really were in that cottage of all places in the world." I was at a loss to understand the embarrassment which she appeared to feel in putting her question. There was nothing very wonderful to my mind in the discovery that she had been in Suffolk, and that she was acquainted with Greenwater Broad. The lake was known all over the country as a favourite resort of picnic parties, and Dermody's pretty cottage used to be one of the most popular attractions of the scene. What really surprised me was to see, as I now plainly saw, that she had some painful association with my old home. I decided on answering her question in such terms as might encourage her to take me into her confidence. In a moment more, I should have told her that my boyhood had been passed to Greenwater Broad. In a moment more, we should have recognized each other, when a trivial interruption suspended the words on my lips. The child ran out of the bedchamber with a quaintly shaped key in her hand. It was one of the things she had taken out of my pockets, and it belonged to the cabin door on board the boat. A sudden fit of curiosity, the insatiable curiosity of a child, had seized her on the subject of this key. She insisted on knowing what door it locked, and when I had satisfied her on that point, she implored me to take her immediately to see the boat. This entreaty led naturally to a renewal of the disputed question of going or not going to bed. By the time the little creature had left us again, with permission to play for a few moments longer, the conversation between Mrs. Van Brandt and myself had taken a new direction. Speaking now of the child's health, we were led naturally to a kindred subject of the child's connection with her mother's dream. "She had been ill with fever," Mrs. Van Brandt began, "and she was just getting better again on the day when I was left deserted in this miserable place. Toward evening she had another attack that frightened me dreadfully. She became perfectly insensible. Her little limbs were stiff and cold. There is one doctor here who has not yet abandoned the town, and of course I sent for him. He thought her insensibility was caused by a sort of cataleptic seizure. At the same time, he comforted me by saying that she was in no immediate danger of death, and he left me certain remedies to be given if certain symptoms appeared. I took her to bed and held her to me with the idea of keeping her warm. Without believing in mesmerism, it has since struck me that we might unconsciously have had some influence over each other which may explain what followed. Do you think it likely? Quite likely. At the same time, the mesmeric theory, if you could believe in it, would keep and carry the explanation further still. Mesmerism would assert not only that you and the child influenced each other, but that, in spite of the distance, you both influenced me. And in that way, mesmerism would account for my vision as the necessary result of a highly developed sympathy between us. Tell me, did you fall asleep with the child in your arms? Yes, I was completely worn out, and I fell asleep in spite of my resolution to watch through the night. In my forlorn situation, forsaken in a strange place, I dreamed of you again, and I appealed to you again as my one protector and friend. The only new thing in the dream was that I thought I had the child with me when I approached you, and that the child put the words into my mind when I wrote in your book. You saw the words, I suppose, and they vanished as before, no doubt. When I awoke, I found the child still lying like a dead creature in my arms. All through the night there was no change in her. She only recovered her senses at noon the next day. Why do you start? What have I said that surprises you? There was good reason for my feeling startled and showing it. On the day and at the hour when the child had come to herself, I had stood on the deck of the vessel and had seen the apparition of her disappear from my view. Did she say anything? I asked when she recovered her senses. Yes, she too had been dreaming that she was in company with you. She said, "He's coming to see us, Mamma, and I have been showing him the way." I asked her where she had seen you, and she spoke confusedly of more places than one. She talked of trees and a cottage and a lake, then of fields and hedges and lonely lanes, then of carriage and horses and a long white road, and then of crowded streets and houses, and then a river and a ship. As to these last objects, there was nothing very wonderful in what she said. The houses, the river, and the ship, which she saw in her dream, she saw in reality when we took her from London to Rotterdam on our way here. But as to the other places, especially the cottage and the lake, as she described them, I can only suppose that her dream was the reflection of mine. I had been dreaming of the cottage and the lake, as I once knew them in years long gone by, and heaven only knows why I had associated them with you, with the scene. Never mind going into that now. I don't know what infatuation it is that makes me trifle in this way with old recollections, which affect me painfully in my present position. We were talking of the child's health. Let's go back to that. It was not easy to return to the topic of her child's health. She had revived my curiosity on the subject of her association with Greenwater Broad. The child was still quietly at play in the bedchamber. My second opportunity was before me. I took it. "I won't distress you," I began. "I will only ask leave, before we change the subject, to put one question to you about the cottage and the lake. As the fatality that pursued us willed it, it was her turn now to be innocently an obstacle in the way of our discovering each other. I can tell you nothing more tonight," she interposed, rising impatiently. "It is time I put the child to bed, and, besides, I can't talk of things that distress me. You must wait for the time, if it ever comes, when I am calmer and happier than I am now." She turned to enter the bedchamber. Acting headlong on the impulse of the moment, I took her by the hand and stopped her. "You have only to choose," I said, "and the calmer and happier time is yours from this moment." "Mine?" she repeated. "What do you mean?" "Say the word," I replied, "and you and your child have a home and a future before you." She looked at me, half bewildered, half angry. Do you offer me your protection?" she asked. "I offer you a husband's protection," I answered. "I ask you to be my wife." She advanced a step nearer to me, with her eyes riveted on my face. "You are evidently ignorant of what has really happened," she said. "And yet, God knows, the child spoke plainly enough." "The child only told me," I rejoined, "what I had heard already on my way here." "All of it?" "All of it." "And you still ask me to be your wife?" "I can imagine no greater happiness than to make you my wife." "Knowing what you know now?" "Knowing what I know now, I ask you confidently to give me your hand. Whatever claim that man may once have had as the father of your child, he has now forfeited it by his infamous desertion of you. In every sense of the word, my darling, you are a free woman. We have had sorrow enough in our lives. Happiness is at last within our reach. Come to me and say yes." I tried to take her in my arms. She drew back, as if I had frightened her. "Never," she said firmly. I whispered my next words so that the child in the inner room may not hear us. "You once said you loved me." "I do love you." "As dearly as ever?" "More dearly than ever." "Kiss me." She yielded mechanically. She kissed me with cold lips, with big tears in her eyes. "You don't love me," I burst out angrily. "You kiss me as if it were a duty. Your lips are cold. Your heart is cold. You don't love me." She looked at me sadly, with a patient smile. "One of us must remember the difference between your position and mine," she said. "You are a man of stainless honor, who holds an undisputed rank in the world. And what am I? I am the deserted mistress of a thief. One of us must remember that. You have generously forgotten it. I must bear it in mind. I dare say I am cold. Suffering has that effect on me, and I own it. I am suffering now. I was too passionately in love with her to feel the sympathy on which she evidently counted in saying those words. A man can respect a woman's scruples when they appeal to him mutely in their looks or in their tears, but the formal expression of them in words only irritates or annoys him. Whose fault is it that you suffer? I retorted coldly. I ask you to make my life a happy one, and your life a happy one, and you are a cruelly wronged woman, but you are not a degraded woman. You are worthy to be my wife, and I am ready to declare it publicly. Come back with me to England. My boat is waiting for you. We can set sail in 2 hours. She dropped into a chair. Her hands fell helplessly into her lap. How cruel, she murmured. How cruel to tempt me. She waited a little and recovered her fatal firmness. No, she said. If I die in doing it, I can still refuse to disgrace you. Leave me, Mr. Germaine. You can show me that one kindness more. For God's sake, leave me. I made a last appeal to her tenderness. Do you know what my life is if I live without you? I asked. My mother is dead. There is not one living creature left in the world whom I love but you. And you ask me to leave you. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? You talk of cruelty. Is there no cruelty in sacrificing the happiness of my life to a miserable scruple of delicacy, to an unreasoning fear of the opinion of the world? I love you, and you love me. There is no other consideration worth a straw. Come back with me to England. Come back and be my wife. She dropped on her knees, and taking my hand, put it silently to her lips. I tried to raise her. It was useless. She steadily resisted me. Does this mean no? I asked. It means, she said in faint, broken tones, that I prize your honor beyond my happiness. If I marry you, your career is destroyed by your wife, and the day will come when you will tell me so. I can suffer, I can die, but I cannot face such a prospect as that. Forgive me and forget me. I can say no more. She let go of my hand and sank on the floor. The utter despair of that action told me far more eloquently than the words which she had just spoken that her resolution was immovable. She had deliberately separated herself from me. Her own act had parted us forever. End of chapter 36. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Chapter 37 of the Two Destinies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Two Destinies by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 37. The Two Destinies. I made no movement to leave the room. I let no sign of sorrow escape me. At last, my heart was hardened against the woman who had so obstinately rejected me. I stood looking down at her with a merciless anger, the bare remembrance of which fills me at this day with a horror of myself. There is but one excuse for me. The shock of that last overthrow of the one hope that held me to life was more than my reason could endure. On that dreadful night, whatever I may have been at other times, I myself believe it. I was a maddened man. I was the first to break the silence. "Get up," I said coldly. She lifted her face from the floor and looked at me as if she doubted whether she had heard aright. "Put on your hat and cloak," I resumed. "I must ask you to go back with me as far as the boat." She rose slowly. Her eyes rested on my face with a dull, bewildered look. "Why am I to go with you to the boat?" she asked. The child heard her. The child ran up to us with her little hat in one hand and the key of the cabin in the other. "I'm ready," she said. "I will open the cabin door." Her mother signed to her to go back to the bedchamber. She went back as far as the door which led into the courtyard, and waited there, listening. I turned to Mrs. Van Brandt with immovable composure, and answered the question which she had addressed to me. "You are left," I said, "without the means of getting away from this place. In 2 hours more the tide will be in my favor, and I shall sail at once on the return voyage. We part this time never to meet again. Before I go, I am resolved to leave you properly provided for. My money is in my traveling bag in the cabin. For that reason, I am obliged to ask you to go with me as far as the boat." "I thank you gratefully for your kindness," she said. "I don't stand in such serious need of help as you suppose." "It is useless to attempt to deceive me," I proceeded. "I have spoken with the head partner of the house of Van Brandt in Amsterdam, and I know exactly what your position is. Your pride must bend low enough to take from my hands the means of subsistence for yourself and your child. If I had died in England—" I stopped. The unexpressed idea in my mind was to tell her that she would inherit a legacy under my will, and that she might quite as becomingly take money from me in my lifetime as to take it from my executors after my death. In forming this thought into words, The associations which called naturally into being revived in me the memory of my contemplated suicide in the Greenwater lake. Mingling with the remembrance thus aroused, there rose in me, unbidden, a temptation so overpoweringly vile, and yet so irresistible in the state of my mind at the moment, that it shook me to the soul. "You have nothing to live for, now that she has refused to be yours," the fiend in me whispered. "Take your leap into the next world, and make the woman whom you love take it with you." While I was looking at her, while my last words to her faltered on my lips, the horrible facilities for the perpetration of the double crime revealed themselves enticingly to my view. My boat was moored in the one part of the decaying harbor in which deep water still lay at the foot of the quay. I had only to induce her to follow me when I stepped on the deck, to seize her in my arms, and to jump overboard with her before she could utter a cry for help. My drowsy sailors, as I knew by experience, were hard to wake and slow to move even when they were roused at last. We should both be drowned before the youngest and the quickest of them could get up from his bed and make his way to the deck. Yes! We should both be struck together out of the ranks of the living at one and the same moment. And why not? She who had again and again refused to be my wife, did she deserve that I should leave her free to go back, perhaps, for the second time to Van Brent? On the evening when I had saved her from the waters of the Scotch River, I had made myself master of her fate. She had tried to destroy herself by drowning. She should drown now in the arms of the man who had once thrown himself between her and death. Self-abandoned to such atrocious reasoning as this, I stood face to face with her, and returned deliberately to my unfinished sentence. If I had died in England, you would have been provided for by my will. What you would have taken from me then, you may take from me now. Come to the boat." A change passed over her face as I spoke. A vague doubt of me began to show itself in her eyes. She drew back a little without making any reply. "Come to the boat," I reiterated. "It is too late." With that answer, she looked across the room at the child, still waiting by the door. "Come, Elfie," she said, calling the little creature by one of her favorite nicknames. "Come to bed." I, too, looked at Elfie. Might she not, I asked myself, be made the innocent means of forcing her mother to leave the house? Trusting to the child's fearless character and her eagerness to see the boat, I suddenly opened the door. As I had anticipated, she instantly ran out. The second door, leading into the square, I had not closed when I entered the courtyard. In another moment, Elfie was out in the square, triumphing in her freedom. The shrill little voice broke the death-like stillness of the place and hour, calling to me again and again to take her to the boat. I turned to Mrs. Van Brandt. The stratagem had succeeded. Elfie's mother could hardly refuse to follow when Elfie led the way. "Will you go with us?" I asked. "Or must I send the money back by the child?" Her eyes rested on me for a moment with a deepening expression of distrust, then looked away again. She began to turn pale. "You are not like yourself tonight," she said. Without a word more, she took her hat and cloak and went out before me into the square. I followed her, closing the doors behind me. She made an attempt to induce the child to approach her. "Come, darling," she said enticingly. "Come and take my hand." But Elfie was not to be caught. She took to her heels and answered from a safe distance. "No," said the child. "You will take me back and put me to bed." She retreated a little further and held up a key. "I shall go first," she cried, "and open the door." She trotted off a few steps in the direction of the harbor and waited for what was to happen next. Her mother suddenly turned and looked close at me under the light of the stars. "Are the sailors on board the boat?" she asked. The question startled me. Had she any suspicion of my purpose? Had my face warned her of lurking danger if she went to the boat? It was impossible. The more likely motive for her inquiry was to find a new excuse for not accompanying me to the harbor. If I told her that the men were on board, she might answer, "Why not employ one of your sailors to bring the money to me to the house?" I took care to anticipate the suggestion in making my reply. "They may be honest men," I said, watching her carefully, "but I don't know them well enough to trust them with money." "Are the sailors on board the boat?" I informed her that the captain and crew slept in the boat, and paused to see what would follow. My reply seemed to rouse her resolution. After a moment's consideration, she turned toward the place at which the child was waiting for us. "Let us go, as you insist on it," she said quietly. I made no further remark. Side by side, in silence, we followed Elfie on our way to the boat. Not a human creature passed us in the streets. Not a light glimmered on us from the grim, black houses. Twice the child stopped and, still keeping slyly out of her mother's reach, ran back to me, wondering at my silence. "Why don't you speak?" she asked. "Have you and Mamma quarreled?" I was incapable of answering her. I could think of nothing but my contemplated crime. Neither fear nor remorse troubled me. Every better instinct, every nobler feeling that I had once possessed, seemed to be dead and gone. Not even a thought of the child's future troubled my mind. I had no power of looking on further than the fatal leap from the boat. Beyond that, there was an utter blank. For the time being, I can only repeat it. My moral sense was obscured. My mental faculties were thrown completely off their balance. The animal part of me lived and moved as usual. The viler animal instincts in me plotted and planned, and that was all. Nobody looking at me would have seen anything but a dull quietude in my face, an immovable composure in my manner. And yet no madman was fitter for restraint or less responsible morally for his own actions than I was at that moment. The night air blew more freshly on our faces. Still led by the child, we had passed through the last street. We were out on the empty open space, which was the landward boundary of the harbor. In a minute more, we stood on the quay, within a step of the gunwale of the boat. I noticed a change in the appearance of the harbor since I had seen it last. Some fishing boats had come in during my absence. They moored, some immediately astern, and some immediately ahead of my own vessel. I looked anxiously to see if any of the fishermen were on board and stirring. Not a living being appeared anywhere. The men were on shore with their wives and their families. Elfie held out her arms to be lifted on board my boat. Mrs. Van Brandt stepped between us as I stooped to take her up. "We will wait here," she said, "while you go into the cabin and get the money." Those words placed it beyond all doubt that she had her suspicions of me. Suspicions, probably, which led her to fear, not for her life, but for her freedom. She might dread being kept a prisoner in the boat, and being carried away by me against her will. More than this, she could not thus far possibly apprehend. The child saved me the trouble of making any remonstrance. She was determined to go with me. "I must see the cabin," she cried, holding up the key. "I must open the door myself." She twisted herself out of her mother's hands and ran round to the other side of me. I lifted her over the gunwale of the boat in an instant. Before I could turn around, her mother had followed her and was standing on the deck. The cabin door, in the position which she now occupied, was on her left hand. The child was close behind her. I was on her right. Before us was the open deck and the low gunwale of the boat, overlooking the deep water. In a moment we might step across. In a moment we might take the fatal plunge. The bare thought of it brought the mad wickedness in me to its climax. I became suddenly incapable of restraining myself. I threw my arm round her waist with a loud laugh. "Come," I said, trying to drag her across the deck. "Come and look at the water." She released herself by a sudden effort of strength that astonished me. With a faint cry of horror, she turned to take the child by the hand and to get back to the quay. I placed myself between her and the sides of the boat, and cut off her retreat in that way. Still laughing, I asked her what she was frightened about. She drew back and snatched the key of the cabin door out of the child's hands. The cabin was the one place of refuge now left to which she could escape from the deck of the boat. In the terror of the moment, she never hesitated. She unlocked the door and hurried down the 2 or 3 steps which led into the cabin, taking the child with her. I followed them, conscious that I had betrayed myself, yet still obstinately, stupidly, madly bent on carrying out my purpose. I have only to behave quietly, I thought to myself, and I shall persuade her to go on deck again. My lamp was burning as I had left it. My traveling bag was on the table. Still holding the child, she stood, pale as death, waiting for me. Elfie's wondering eyes rested inquiringly on my face as I approached them. She looked half inclined to cry. The suddenness of the mother's actions had frightened the child. I did my best to compose Elfie before I spoke to her mother. I pointed out the different objects which were likely to interest her in the cabin. "Go and look at them," I said. "Go and amuse yourself." The child still hesitated. "Are you angry with me?" she asked. "No, no." "Are you angry with Mamma?" "Certainly not." I turned to Mrs. Van Brandt. "Tell Elfie if I am angry with you," I said. She was perfectly aware, in her critical position, of the necessity of humoring me. Between us, we succeeded in composing the child. She turned away to examine, in high delight, the new and strange objects which surrounded her. Meanwhile, her mother and I stood together, looking at each other by the light of the lamp, with an assumed composure which hid our true faces like a mask. In that horrible situation, the grotesque and the terrible, always together in this strange life of ours, came together now. On either side of us, the one sound that broke the sinister and threatening silence was the lumpish snoring of the sleeping captain and crew. She was the first to speak. "If you wish to give me the money," she said, trying to propitiate me in that way, "I am ready to take it now." I unlocked my traveling bag. As I looked into it for the leather case which held my money, my overpowering desire to get her on deck again, and my mad impatience to commit the fatal act, became too strong to be controlled. "We shall be cooler on deck," I said. "Let us take the bag up there." She showed wonderful courage. I could almost see the cry for help rising to her lips. She repressed it. She had still presence of mind enough to foresee what might happen before she could rouse the sleeping men. "We have a light here to count the money by," she answered. "I don't feel at all too warm in the cabin. Let us stay here a little longer. See how Elfie is amusing herself." Her eyes rested on me as she spoke. Something in the expression of them quieted me for the time. I was able to pause and think. I might take her on deck by force before the men could interfere, but her cries would rouse them. They would hear the splash in the water, and they might be quick enough to rescue us. It would be wiser, perhaps, to wait a little and trust to my cunning to delude her into leaving the cabin of her own accord. I put the bag back on the table and began to search for the leather money case. My hands were strangely clumsy and helpless. I could only find the case after scattering half the contents of the bag on the table. The child was near me at the time and noticed what I was doing. "Oh, how awkward you are!" she burst out in her frankly fearless way. "Let me put your bag tidy, do, please." I granted the request impatiently. Elfie's restless desire to be always doing something, instead of amusing me as usual, irritated me now. The interest that I had once felt in the charming little creature was all gone, and innocent love was a feeling that was stifled in the poisoned atmosphere of my mind that night. The money I had with me was mostly composed of notes of the Bank of England. Carefully keeping up appearances, I set aside the sum that would probably be required to take a traveller back to London, and I put all that remained into the hands of Mrs. Van Brandt. Could she suspect me of a design on her life now? "That will do for the present," I said. "I can communicate with you in the future through Messrs. Van Brandt of Amsterdam." She took the money mechanically. Her hand trembled. Her eyes met mine with a look of piteous entreaty. She tried to revive my old tenderness for her. She made a last appeal to my forbearance and consideration. "We may part friends," she said in low, trembling tones. "And as friends, we may meet again when time has taught you to think forgivingly of what has passed between us tonight." She offered me her hand. I looked at her without taking it. I penetrated her motive in appealing to my old regard for her, still suspecting me. She had tried her last chance of getting safely on shore. "The less we say of the past, the better," I answered with ironical politeness. "It is getting late, and you will agree with me that Elfie ought to be in her bed." I looked round at the child. "Be quick, Elfie," I said. "Your mamma is going away." I opened the cabin door and offered my arm to Mrs. Van Brandt. "This boat is my house for the time being," I resumed. "When ladies take leave of me after a visit, I escort them to the dock. Pray, take my arm." She started back. For the second time, she was on the point of crying for help, and for the second time, she kept that last desperate alternative in reserve. "I haven't seen your cabin yet," she said, her eyes wild with fear, a forced smile on her lips as she spoke. "There are several little things here that interest me. Give me another minute or two to look at them." She turned away to get nearer to the child, under pretense of looking round the cabin. I stood on guard before the open door, watching her. She made a second pretense. She noisily overthrew a chair as if by accident, and then waited to discover whether her trick had succeeded in waking the men. The heavy snoring went on. Not a sound of a person moving was audible on either side of us. "My men are heavy sleepers," I said, smiling significantly. "Don't be alarmed. You have not disturbed them. Nothing wakes these Dutch sailors when they are once safe in port." She made no reply. My patience was exhausted. I left the door and advanced toward her. She retreated in speechless terror, passing behind the table to the other end of the cabin. I followed her until she had reached the extremity of the room and could get no further. She met the look I fixed on her. She shrunk into a corner and called for help. In the deadly terror that possessed her, she lost the use of her voice. A low moaning, hardly louder than a whisper, was all that passed her lips. Already, in imagination, I stood with her on the gunwale. Already I felt the cold contact of the water, when I was startled by a cry behind me. I turned round. The cry had come from Elfie. She had apparently just discovered some new object in the bag, and she was holding it up in admiration, high above her head. "Mamma! Mamma!" the child cried excitedly. "Look at this pretty thing! Oh, do ask him if I may have it!" Her mother ran to her, eager to seize the poorest excuse for getting away from me. I followed. I stretched out my hands to seize her. She suddenly turned round on me, a woman transformed. A bright flush was on her face. An eager wonder sparkled in her eyes. Snatching Elfie's coveted object out of the child's hand, she held it up before me. I saw it under the lamplight. It was my little forgotten keepsake, the green flag. "How came you by this?" she asked, in breathless anticipation of my reply. Not the slightest trace was left in her face of the terror that had convulsed it barely a minute since. "How came you by this?" she repeated, seizing me by the arm and shaking me in the ungovernable impatience that possessed her. My head turned giddy. My heart beat furiously under the conflict of emotions that she had roused in me. My eyes were riveted on the green flag. The words that I wanted to speak were words that refused to come to me. I answered mechanically, "I have had it since I was a boy." She dropped her hold on me and lifted her hands with a gesture of ecstatic gratitude. A lovely angelic brightness flowed like light from heaven over her face. For one moment she stood enraptured. The next, she clasped me passionately to her bosom and whispered in my ear, "I am Mary Dermody. I made it for you." The shock of discovery, following so closely on all that I had suffered before it, was too much for me. I sank, fainting, in her arms. When I came to myself, I was lying on my bed in the cabin. Elfie was playing with the green flag, and Mary was sitting by me with my hand in hers. One long look of love passed silently from her eyes to mine, from mine to hers. In that look, the kindred spirits were united. The two destinies were fulfilled. The end of the story. The finale. End of chapter 37. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The wife writes and closes the story of the two destinies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Two Destinies by Wilkie Collins. The wife writes and closes the story. There was a little introductory narrative prefixed to the two destinies, which you may possibly have forgotten by this time. The narrative was written by myself, a citizen of the United States visiting England with his wife. It described a dinner party at which we were present, given by a Mr. and Mrs. Germaine in celebration of their marriage, and it mentioned the circumstances under which we were entrusted with the story, which has just come to an end in these pages. Having read the manuscript, Mr. and Mrs. Germaine left it to us to decide whether we should continue our friendly intercourse with them or not. At 3:00 p.m., we closed the last leaf of the story. 5 minutes later, I sealed it up in its cover. My wife put her bonnet on, and there we were, bound straight for Mr. Germaine's house, when the servant brought a letter into the room addressed to my wife. She opened it, looked at the signature, and discovered that it was Mary Germaine. Seeing this, we sat down side by side to read the letter before we did anything else. On reflection, it strikes me that you may do well to read it too. Mrs. Germaine is surely by this time a person in whom you feel some interest, and she is on that account, as I think, the fittest person to close the story. Here is her letter. Dear Madame, or may I say, dear friend, be prepared, if you please, for a little surprise. When you read these lines, we shall have left London for the Continent. After you went away last night, my husband decided on taking this journey. Seeing how keenly he felt the insult offered to me by the ladies whom we had asked to our table, I willingly prepared for our sudden departure. When Mr. Germaine is far away from his false friends, my experience of him tells me that he will recover his tranquillity. That is enough for me. My little daughter goes with us, of course. Early this morning I drove to the school in the suburbs at which she is being educated, and took her away with me. It is needless to say that she was delighted at the prospect of travelling. She shocked the schoolmistress by waving her hat over her head and crying, "Hooray!" like a boy. The good lady was very careful to inform me that my daughter could not possibly have learned to cry "Hooray!" in her house. You have probably by this time read the narrative which I have committed to your care. I hardly dare ask how I stand in your estimation now. Is it possible that I might have seen you and your good husband if we had not left London so suddenly? As things are, I must now tell you in writing what I should infinitely have preferred saying to you with your friendly hand in mine. Your knowledge of the world has no doubt already attributed the absence of the ladies at our dinner table to some report affecting my character. You are quite right. While I was taking Elfie away from her school, my husband called on one of his friends who dined with us, Mr. Waring, and insisted on an explanation. Mr. Waring referred him to the woman who is known to you by this time as Mr. Van Brandt's lawful wife. In her intervals of sobriety, she possesses some musical talent. Mrs. Waring had met her at a concert for a charity, and had been interested in the story of her wrongs, as she called them. My name was, of course, mentioned. I was described as a cast-off mistress of Van Brandt, who had persuaded Mr. Germaine into disgracing himself by marrying her, and becoming the stepfather of her child. Mrs. Waring thereupon communicated what she had heard to the other ladies who were her friends. The result you saw for yourselves when you dined at our house. I inform you of what has happened without making any comment. Mr. Germaine's narrative has already told you that I foresaw the deplorable consequences which might follow our marriage, and that I, over and over again, God knows at what cost of misery to myself, refused to be his wife. It was only when my poor little green flag had revealed us to each other that I lost all control over myself. The old time on the banks of the lake came back to me. My heart hungered for its darling of happier days, and I said yes, when, as you may think, I ought to have still said no. Will you take poor old Dame Dermody's view of it, and believe that the kindred spirits, once reunited, could be parted no more? Or will you take my view, which is simpler still? I do love him so dearly, and he is so fond of me. In the meantime, our departure from England seems to be the wisest course that we can adopt. As long as this woman lives, she will say again of me what she has already said, whenever she can find the opportunity. My child might hear the reports about her mother, and might be injured by them when she gets older. We propose to take up our abode, for a time at least, in the neighborhood of Naples. Here, or further away yet, we may hope to live without annoyance among a people whose social law is the law of mercy. Whatever may happen, we have always one last consolation to sustain us. We have love. You talked of traveling on the continent when you dined with us. If you should wander our way, the English consul at Naples is a friend of my husband's, and he will have our address. I wonder whether we shall ever meet again. It does seem hard to charge the misfortunes of my life on me, as if they were my faults. Speaking of my misfortunes, I may say, before I close this letter, that the man to whom I owe them is never likely to cross my path again. The Van Brandts of Amsterdam have received certain information that he is now on his way to New Zealand. They are determined to prosecute him if he returns. He is little likely to give them the opportunity. The traveling carriage is at the door. I must say good-bye. My husband sends to you both his kindest regards and best wishes. His manuscript will be quite safe when you leave London, if you send it to his bankers at the address enclosed. Think of me sometimes, and think of me kindly. I appeal confidently to your kindness, for I don't forget that you kissed me at parting. Your grateful friend, if you will let her be your friend, Mary Germaine. We are rather impulsive people in the United States, and we decide on long journeys by sea or land without making the slightest fuss about it. My wife and I looked at each other when we had read Mrs. Germaine's letter. "London is dull," I remarked, and waited to see what came of it. My wife read my remark the right way directly. "Suppose we try Naples," she said. "That is all. Permit us to wish you good-bye. We are off to Naples." End of The Wife Writes and Closes the Story. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. End of The Two Destinies by Wilkie Collins.